All of this in a context where voices for more technology regulation are becoming louder in many places, where some of those regulatory initiatives are underway already, but possibly have also different aims and different forms in different parts of the world. Clearly, online technologies are a global phenomena, and that's why certainly the global partnerships will have an important role to play here. And so that role is something we would like to explore as part of this panel. Certainly also the world is and the global partnership is more than just a transatlantic and a northern partnership. So an important question to be addressed will also be how can the global south that will one way or another be also impacted from norm setting that happens in the north. How can the global south participate in those discussions and partnerships in a meaningful way? And also how can the voices of corporations and civil society be heard in those partnerships? So this is some of the issues I'm planning to discuss today with three of our panelists who we have directly live here. The first of them is Moira Whelan. She's the Director for Democracy and Technology at the National Democratic Institute. And before that, she's actually worked also as a founding partner in a consultancy firm that specializes in assisting technology in companies to engage with government. So interesting view on both of those roles, I guess. Also with us, we have Professor Fabio Stabile. He's the executive director of the Institute of Technology and Science, if I translate that correctly from Brazilian into English, from Brazil in Rio de Janeiro. And then we have from Microsoft, Cornelia Putra. She's the lead of the European Rule of Law and Responsible Technology team of Microsoft that focuses on the impact of new technologies and regulatory frameworks that hopefully then also meet the expectations of society. Cornelia is replacing Jan Neutze, who some of you might have seen on the original agenda and who unfortunately could not join us today. We were also hoping to welcome members of the European Parliament directly here with us. Unfortunately, the timing seemed very inconvenient. Many of them are right now traveling back from Strasbourg to Brussels. But some of them were actually happy to send us a video message that we're going to show very shortly. And so now, just before I'm opening the floor to our panelists, I would like to invite everybody who's watching this to leave questions and comments in the chat function here. We will hopefully be able to pick some of them and put them to our panelists a little bit later. And yeah, just before then moving to the panelists, maybe we can start by showing the two videos from the MEPs that we have received. The first one is by Ms. Kim van Sparentak. So she's an MEP and member of the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the Digital Age. She's a member of the Green Parties in the Netherlands. Yeah, so here we already heard a few, or at least one example of the kind of regulation that is initially coming maybe outside of or from Europe, but then will likely have global impact. So this was about the, amongst others, about the global data protection regulation, but obviously more is coming. And I think some of the words that we heard here were also already kind of indicating what might be in the Digital Services Act in the future. So I think already very illustrative of some of the topics we might discuss. Now, the second video is by Mr. Brando Benifei. He's also an MPP, also member of the Special Committee on AI in a Digital Age, and he is from the Social Democrats in Italy. So if we can launch this video as well, please. Yeah, and so here Brando helped us a bit to zoom in on one specific technology that we wanted to discuss, artificial intelligence, and also maybe highlighting the core of the European model of approaching artificial intelligence, where they want to put like the human-centric approach very much at the forefront of development and regulation in this field. Now, without much further ado, I'd like now to hand over to Moira Whelan immediately for her initial statement. And I think you're muted, Moira.
I am. Thank you for having me today. Thank you, Peter, and to my fellow panelists. And that was really a wonderful introduction by the MPs. And thanks to them for taking such an important leadership role in this conversation. I was heartened to hear one of the things I want to discuss today, which is about the impact of their actions on the rest of the world and on the global South. So that was really excellent. But I thought I would start us off, and Peter, our subject today is not just digital, but partnerships. So first of all, acknowledging that we're happy to join International IDEA in one of our vanguard partnership projects at NDI called the Design for Democracy Coalition, where we're trying to bring the Global South technology companies, to include Microsoft, and others to the table to discuss many of these issues. Because one of the things that we have learned over our work around the world, NDI works in more than 50 countries around the world, is that a lot of the challenges we're facing is that the technology tools we have that are designed within the confines of the success that democracy has brought to our economies and to our societies are actually becoming tools of power by autocratic regimes. And, we see the misuse of many of these because at their core, at their fundamental root, they don't employ and look to democracy as a basis, but rather power and profit, and prioritizing that over this system of a fully inclusive technology. And we believe that fundamentally that we can create a digital environment that does focus on full inclusion of all populations, to include marginalized populations, women, and that we can put that at the forefront of our technology. But we must be cautious that there are plenty of technology that we've seen deployed in the past few years and months that pose a challenge to that. So looking at Pegasus NSO and the surveillance technology used against democratic activists around the world, looking at Clearview AI and its use to monitor and surveil. So I think one of the things we've noticed and sort of where we are in our evolution of thinking, and I'm interested in what my fellow panelists have to say, is that we've become acutely aware of the problem and that we need to move to solutions. So in some ways, we have the tools that we need and we need to strengthen them. And in that category, I would put traditional parliaments and making sure that we exercise the tools that we do have. So around the world, for instance, parliaments are an endangered species. And, so when we talk about bringing the global South and more countries into a multi-stakeholder system, we're running into a problem that's a muscle that doesn't exist. The second is that, I speak anecdotally that being able to enter into a global conversation is not always the top priority on technology issues, is not always top of the list for many of the countries in which NDI works. So what we really need to focus on is meeting them where they are, and starting with questions of getting parliaments wired and creating systems for transparency that enable us to bridge the conversation into one of global norms and one of participating in that global conversation to represent their own interests. I think the other thing I would say is that it is critical that, as we see our European colleagues moving forward on this legislation, which is really important, and again, as I said, really heartening to hear them discuss the potential impact of how this could be used by an autocratic actor. So what we see is a cybersecurity law in a very positive European context. I was just on a call earlier today with friends in South Asia who are very concerned by how that will impact their own populations and the message that will be received in their region by the legislation. So keeping that at the core of our concern, and instead prioritizing, or I shouldn't say instead of prioritizing, but first prioritizing bringing people to the table around norms development. So we, along with Microsoft and others, are very involved with the Paris call, for instance, and bringing people into that conversation, which, we recently did an assessment of our own, the countries in which NDI works, and many aren't signatories. And we need to spend our time and energy sort of bringing people into that conversation, which is a broader gap than I think we often discuss. So I welcome the opportunity to have this conversation today. I also welcome the opportunity to broaden this out into the emerging technologies that were just discussed, such as AI. NDI has also done extensive research into regimes and concepts around the deployment of 5G, as well as digital ID, and many of these other emerging technologies that are finding very immediate implementation challenges that will have a direct impact on democracy, because we aren't having a normative conversation around it. And the structures of creating a multi-stakeholder system are not as much of the norm in the rest of the world as we see in the North. And I think that the call to action for all of us on this Democracy Day or Democracy Week is to really recommit ourselves to broadening that conversation, meeting people where they are, and inviting voices in that we don't traditionally hear from, both in terms of countries and governments, but also civil society, marginalized populations, and broadening, being proactive about making sure that we're reaching out, not just opening the door. So I'll stop there. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with our colleagues. We have much to cover in this digital space.
Thanks so much, Moira, for many important points, and not least also the point that, of course, Northern partnerships will always discuss regulations and norms in a mostly positive context, which may be entirely different in other places and maybe the Global South. And this is why it's very important to have a speaker here today as well, who can hopefully represent the Global South and a few not so Northern perspectives here. So on to you, Fabro, for your first statements.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you all panelists. Welcome to Brazil. So everyone should be aware of the tale of the elephant in the dark room. This is the fairy tale, the myth that 5 people enter a room with an elephant in the room, lights are off, and then you try to imagine what's in the room, and everyone gets a different piece of it. And I think this is why collaboration global or global south is so important, because in the end, designing regulations for AI or disinformation, it is about good design. It is about understanding the problem. Let me give you 2 examples. The first one on fighting disinformation. So later on today, I have to the Congress, Brazilian Congress, to give an idea of how they are regulating the ecosystems of disinformation. What is the fake news draft bill of law presents for the ecosystems? And I'll start the talk with the Ford T line of production. If you remember, Ford T is kind of the Ford is how the first automobile industry designed a series of processes to produce a car. You can have any one as long as it's black, it's a Ford, and so on. Regulating automobile company from a Ford T-Mobile perspective might be a good idea in the 40s, not today. So what is the problem with how we are regulating disinformation in Brazil? It's basically a tool-oriented, a platform-oriented solution. You are designing rules for how WhatsApp and Facebook works. This is not a bad decision. This is just a partial decision. It's bad design. You look for the information, and it's an ecosystem that produces information. There is money flowing in. There is a private sector being used. There is a civil society. There is a complex issue. But if you make everyone in the ecosystems behaves like Facebook and WhatsApp, you create a problem elsewhere. So let's say, for example, the payment markets. They will be affected by the rules designed to fight information messages. Let things about governments, judicial systems use WhatsApp and Facebook as others. They will be affected. Maybe other companies will have less data, more data because of how we are regulating Facebook and WhatsApp to address the problem of disinformation. And when you look to the code of practices of Europe, for example, you see a very good results on how private sector becoming more active in providing data, solutions, and so on to fight disinformation. But having this tool approach to design is just a bad design. And how we see that? Because we look to other countries, Australia, UK, EU, China, US, you see how the solution needs a different design. And this is where collaboration comes in hand. And the second example is about AI regulation. Recently in Brazil, we have two bills being discussed on AI regulation. They are largely inspired by GDPR, which is not a bad idea. They are largely inspired by OECD and EU landmarks, which is a good idea. But what they did is that they got part of the solution and they forgot the diagnosis. So when they defined AI, for example, they defined it literally translating the EU debate, but they forgot the next. They just said artificial intelligence is bang, these things. And this is a huge design problem because either OECD or EU adopts this is a rule of realm of AI, and here is an annex or here are examples. They forgot that. This is now fixed. But if you look to other countries and decide to regulate risk, but not the ecosystem, the problem, it becomes the elephant in the dark room problem. And how do we see this? How we prove a design is a bad design or a poor design? When we look to other countries and we collaborate. When we say that sometimes solutions, they need to be put in perspective with other countries, so it becomes clear that maybe the remedy we're trying to use might endanger the problem, worsen the scenario, and not solve it. So we are working with problems with technology and society that are global, and we have lots of similarities. The agenda setting of policy becomes very global, very quickly, and shapes really fast. Without a good collaboration and multi-stakeholders in particular, it's very hard to have a good design. So this is why I think such initiative is so important and so strong, because it allows us to look at the problem and say, what is the good design for us to start regulating, and not what is the remedy for this or that problem, which left alone might endanger the problem and worsen the scenario rather than improving it.
Thank you so much, Fabro. And with this, I'd like to hand over directly to Cornelia then and share some thoughts from a Microsoft perspective.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thanks for the invitation. For all those who wanted to see Jan, my colleague, I apologize. You have to deal with me today. A lot of things have already been said, and a variety of aspects that we hope that we can further discuss during this discussion here. I will start eventually with reminding us also of the huge benefits that new emerging technologies bring to the table. We should not forget about this when we're talking, rightly so, about the guardrails that are required and norms that need to be set. The opportunities, I think, have been mostly and fantastically demonstrated during the COVID pandemic. Technology has allowed economy to largely continue, and you can just imagine eventually had this pandemic hit us 10 years earlier and the consequences that had at that time. Certainly not the same. We are still in a pandemic. We're looking towards recovery, but I think the way technology has helped lots of communities to continue to work, for schools to stay open is a really wonderful proof point in how technology helps society. And of course, we see lots of vital uses of that technology in societal, really critical challenges that we face, such as climate change. or poverty or even health, as I just mentioned. So with this said, of course, we are seeing and see this almost every day in newspapers, bad outcomes when technology sites are misused or not carefully used. And both aspects need to be somewhat addressed. I will say that a number of the things that I've heard here today, we can sort of portamentalize and look at them in a little bit more detail. The issues around content moderation are slightly distinct from the issues that we're dealing with AI. And to a certain extent, I think the world has lost or has had an awakening of the potential negative or effects, already starting with the Arab Spring, where at the beginning, everybody has hailed the ability of that technology in bringing democracy to other regions of the world. And that has not really worked out the way everybody was eventually hoping at the beginning. And then we have seen other areas, disasters such as in Myanmar, and we should take this all into consideration. There has been, and this is an important part of the trust conversation here, there has been a lot of negative, bad examples over the last years that have really had really negative impact on society. So the first MEP, Kim van Sparenak, she focused a lot on the DSA. That's in a discussion in itself. In this context, I will say what I have in the last couple of years experienced in the political debates, working on all these different files from DSA to sexual child abuse, image material, legislation, privacy, etc., is that there are significant value tensions that we need to somehow tackle, and there is not always easy solutions when you, for example, think about encryption or end-to-end encryption, or when you think about the value tensions in the context of data flows. So these are a couple of aspects. Another aspect that I would like to bring to the table is, of course, the guardrails that are necessary around AI. And here I think we have an enormous opportunity to think beyond the AI Act, and I will commend the Commission for not only proposing the AI Act, but also accompanying the AI Act with the coordinated plan that also, when you look carefully, has a section on external engagements with the OECD, the World Economic Forum, the transatlantic relations here in particular, but also Singapore and other democratic regions, where there is an attempt to bring this human-centric AI vision to eventually enormous discussion around what to do, and we can discuss this a little bit more. And of course, the Transatlantic Tech Council has put this also on the agenda, and we're very hopeful that there is something very concrete coming out of those conversations. I will eventually stop here. There's one additional issue that I wanted to raise because, Maura, I think you mentioned that and this is the partnership. None of these issues, and we haven't even mentioned all the current problems that we need to tackle, require multi-stakeholderism. They require partnerships between governments, private sector, and civil society. Otherwise, we'll not be able to solve them and to increase really the acceptance and the trust in those technologies.
Thank you, Cornelia. Maybe just connecting to what you said last, and thinking especially about your experience, of course, bringing in the corporate sector in this, also Moira's experiences of both kind of the civil society angle and her previous connections between government and civil society. Would you have any ideas for those partnerships, how to effectively bring in, those other stakeholders that might not naturally be part of the table of those partnerships initially. So anything from the companies to civil society. Are there any success stories, any models that you can suggest?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in on that and say that, one, I think going back to some of the things Cornelia said is that technology does help in a lot of ways, and we can't inherently look at a piece of technology or any technology structure as inherently good or bad, but rather look to the environment that surrounds it. So, one of the kind of roads I think we need to course correct on is, for instance, a US versus China dynamic that has Chinese tech as bad and American tech as bad, but lacks an understanding of looking at the environment that may surround either one, right? And either a regulatory or normative framework around that. And so I think we can look to some success points in partnerships. First and foremost, I would say that in all of the major tech companies, there's someone to return my phone call when we speak, and that's a recent, past decade experience, that there is now a community of practice to speak of around these issues and various organizations that we're pointing to. So, in the counterterrorism community, you look at GIFCT. There's also the Global Network Initiative, where civil society and tech companies can have Chatham House rules conversations to have some very frank conversations about the challenges both are seeing. And I would urge us to better resource those and better elevate and empower those structures, because I think that they can be really effective. In really tangible ways, we can also see course corrections on major errors, and the one that just is so recent and springs to mind for me is after everything we saw in Burma and Myanmar around Facebook and the use of Facebook by an authoritarian regime. What we saw in Afghanistan was, within hours, the deployment of a hibernate button for democracy actors that was deployed in language for users in Afghanistan to hibernate their accounts so that, one, they weren't surveilled and detected by a Taliban regime, but two, could preserve those data and connections for proof of identity at a later date in a way that, at first there was some concern around GDPR, and we were able to quickly address as a community that problem to say, okay, this is within keeping of, this is within intent, it's such a unique circumstance, but we were able to provide a model for that quick, what we deployed here, we can quickly turn on over here. And I think what we want to see is more of that. And more of that around traditional democracy issues, such as, we can go on, but, and we haven't even talked about just the internet in general, of just keeping it on. But, I would urge us to look at the partnerships that allow us to have those layered conversations. So, very successful in terms of D4D, and what Peter and I work on is elevating some of those immediate concerns around elections, but then broadening the aperture, using that to broaden the aperture of technology companies to look at democratic concerns as more than just elections, right? That it's about full inclusion, it's about access, it's about data and AI. Picking on the United States for just one moment, I would also say I was very impressed by our own public-private partnership review of AI that recently came out, as well as the new Biden administration leaders on these issues. I think we heard a lot of the positive sounds and a lot of an acknowledgement of the gaps that exist in terms of the US coming to the table. But we do need to acknowledge that we still don't have the structures in place. They're not there quite yet. But I do see the Summit for Democracy that the Biden administration is proposing as a real opportunity to make this tangible, versus a broad conversation to really bring it to the forefront of issues of human rights, transparency, anti-corruption, and move us in a positive direction. So acknowledging both the scale to which we've developed these communities of practice over the past decade, but that we need to move a lot faster to keep up, because dictators are scaling at a faster rate than we are at this point.
Fabro or Cornelia, anything you want to pick up immediately here?
Yeah, thanks, Mara, for mentioning the GNI and also GIF-CT. I think one addition here that I think is worthwhile to mention in the context of AI, and of course there's many more partnerships that are functioning and existing at that level, is the Partnership on AI, which is a multi-stakeholderism per se, has been created really by the engineers at a starting point that were forward-leaning in trying to think about the development and deployment of AI that is ethical in nature. So their appetite to get stakeholders around the table has now led to a really wonderful partnership that focuses very much into these socio-technical issues that AI has to overcome or that need to be solved when trying to operationalize these ethical principles that now exist across the globe and are fairly homogeneous when you look at them, really. That's I think an important part. And then, of course, a lot of the partnerships that we deal here in the European Union, I was just reminded by the GIF-CT, is the EU Internet Forum, for example, which is led by DG Home, but it is really a partnership with companies where member state representatives participate in the context of terrorism and crime against children. So there are these variety of different types of partnerships that seek to move the needle forward towards solutions. And I think you can see change of mindset over the years, certainly. Think about the code of practice on disinformation that we might also want to talk about a little bit. This said, there are also tools that are necessary in this space around democratic discourse. And I think that is sort of where election and content moderation come together as issues that need to be solved. How do we have open space discourse so that manipulation cannot happen that easily? How can we safeguard these open spaces and these agoras that are necessary for the political and democratic debates to happen, that they are not infiltrated by disinformation, misinformation, deepfakes, etc. So there's a lot of work that is currently underway in the context of redefining the objectives of the Code of Practice on Disinformation. And of course, the Commission has taken very much a lead in also thinking through these issues. Journalism is a big part of the democracy debate as well. We can also talk a little bit about that and how companies can really support this. This goes from how do we remunerate publishers in that space, but it also how can technology support journalists in need. So there's a variety and many aspects that require us simultaneously to move forward.
Fabro, anything you want to add?
That quickly, because this is a really good debate. I think we have an issue here that we don't have the policy framing to understand it. So when you look at how we regulated traffic roads in the 50s, we see a risk-based approach, but we had kind of like a decades to understand a commodity regulation process in our countries. When we look to biodiversity and the tree that comes out of that, we have a different approach. We really see that we need to be transnational. We really understand to be multi-stakeholder. And then when I look at the technology and society, it's clear that at least we need to have strong regulation bodies for regulation, co-regulation and self-regulation, and they need to be integrated. And this is not simple at all. So this collaboration, and I think technology might be the key piece that is showing how we can do it. It's how fast we're growing, understanding how to design these institutions, to design these collaborative mechanisms, and at the same time, how much civil society pushes for problems to be solved. And AI and disinformation are good two examples of that. So I think the collaboration, most stakeholders, is the key for the solution. At the same time, we shouldn't expect to solve the problem immediately or as efficient as we want, because we are coming from a status quo where we don't have kind of the governance systems, the institutions, the knowledge to regulate it. But I think we are in the right track. And although it sometimes might be frustrating, I think this is the only track.
Yeah, that's very interesting what you say, Fabio. Obviously, things have to be very fast, including regulation has to be very fast. And this is maybe not a strong point of regulation in general, to be super responsive. That maybe actually brings me to another question about whether any such partnerships should only be about regulations. Or should it also be about softer measures? Cornelia has mentioned the code of practice on disinformation, for example. There could be other soft law measures maybe as well. So should those partnerships maybe look a little bit beyond regulation itself? Anybody who wants to answer?
Well, I would just put a finer point on what Fabio indicated, and for our colleagues watching, a way to sort of formulate moving some of these conversations forward, which is, and to get at your regulation process, we sometimes try to chase an end versus a process, right? So even where we see successful regulation, it's often unsupported by enforcement mechanisms, access to, to implement that regulation, that it's a chase to kind of stamp something like we did something. Okay, we regulated, versus acknowledging that because of the nature of what we're talking about, that technology will continue to evolve, that we will have these challenges, that what we need to be putting in place, and why democracy and human-centered design is so important to be at the center of this, is that what we're talking about is building a process and a system and an environment around these issues, much more so than the actual regulation itself. So I think, I would challenge my colleagues who are watching to sort of divide in that thinking. The second is to acknowledge that where we have seen success in the regulation space has been around the question of liability. And that what we're seeing, the biggest motivator for both governments and for companies, has been around avoiding liability, whether it be child pornography, genocide. Some of these big issues are true motivators, when what we really want to see is a motivation of inclusion and that full participation of all people. And that can be everything from hate speech and disinformation conversations on the way to data regimes and digital ID around who gets to vote and who doesn't. We're seeing now in the world that the power of these technologies are allowing entire populations to be written off and disappeared and not be able to participate. So I think, when we're framing our thinking, we should acknowledge the realities, but move ourselves from one of liability, which is a very immediate and tangible thing, and into one of how do we get to full inclusion, which is a greater challenge.
May I just ask one question about this, because it's a process around regulation? I think you also meant kind of the enforcement and so on. One thing I've also noticed sometimes in those regulatory discussions, there's this assumption, well, we put this in place now and it's going to be forever. So we stuff in as much as we can, even though we don't yet know everything. So is there also maybe a need for more kind of a dynamic approach to regulation itself? We say, well, this is certainly not forever, but maybe for a shorter horizon, and what would be a more reasonable short-term horizon for those kind of things? Would any of you have any thoughts on this?
I'd love to jump in here if my co-panelists allow. So it's an interesting observation, and I will throw in an additional point here before trying answer or give even a good example where this has changed. The a challenge is eventually also just our own human behaviors. It's not only that we believe that once the regulation is done, a certain problem is fixed forever. It's also that there is time frames around legislations to get something done within an elective period, rather than eventually having a commitment from one elected period to the other to continue solving the problem, so that the continuation is rather there. That would be an excellent commitment from governmental bodies to secure that we are actually constantly on a path. There is not after 5 years an end to it and everything can be celebrated as success and then something new starts. So that is something that in my experience, in the European frame, has always bugged me a little bit. If we could get a little bit of a mind shift here as well. Maura mentioned something which I really liked about this trial and error. Things might not always be right. We are in a place with technology that we need to accept that we're making some errors from time to time, and everybody does. So this learn from your errors and become better, this type of mindset is extremely necessary also in the space of creating the rules and norms for society. Other than that, I would definitely agree both with Maura and the points that were made that the governance structures are not there entirely, although I will also underline a positive example, which is the AI Act, where the Commission has focused in on the known high risk use cases, but also has a structure put in place that potentially new high risks that that the society becomes aware of can be added to this list. Now, whether the way it's structured is the right way, this is a different debate, but that we are acknowledging things change in this field and we need to address them quicker than through a regulation. I think there is some good examples here too.
Fabro, you seem to be shaking your head. Yes.
It reminds me of a really important topic that we should highlight, which is good diagnosis tools. So for example, we're always talking about platform workers. So the EU does a brilliant consultation and report on that. And then when we look to the platform workers report, you see that we have at least 4 completely different scenarios to look at. Highly skilled or low skilled, really frequently or frequent types of jobs. And this makes completely different. Without a good diagnosis tools, it's really hard to discuss what kind of regulation we are talking about. And why these tools are so important? Because usually they forget non-EU, non-US, non-Australia spaces. And this is our fault, right? We should be producing these documents. But get, for example, regulation in Germany on disinformation. The regulation on Germany was used in Turkey in a completely different reality. And what was my enhanced democracy in other country might enhance censorship. And so this whole debate of diagnosis, somehow they should include all the countries in the spectrum of how this will be translated or impacted. And I know that the debates in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Kenya, and others, usually we don't have these tools or these tools don't look at us. And this is a matter of importance because we know that the debate will affect, but we would love to hear how this plays a role. The private sector, nonetheless, is possibly the one doing the most diagnosis and most resources on that because they act globally, so they keep looking for how this will impact business in the countries. And this is a realm where governments might do more. They might do more collaborations, either from data protection agencies, from governments, and so on, to produce better diagnoses that include the Global South. It is, okay, what's the problem is? What is the effect? What is the drawing? What's the map mapping we have to start to understand the issue?
Yeah, I hear this loudly from you, Faber, right? Understanding what the issues are, and the issues are different in different contexts, and there needs to be a better understanding that should come out of those partnerships. Anybody to reflect on this one?
Yeah, I will say that maybe just, of course, it is the GDPR effect. When I start thinking about that, there is once you adapt your engineering systems and the processes into place, there is also, of course, an interest for companies to be able to scale, to have one compliance system in place. This is one of the reasons, I believe, why the GDPR had, in fact, such a global effect. The translation of the rules is really done through standards, where through standards you can compare the rules that exist in Europe with the rules that exist in other places. And that is not a bad thing. So maybe thinking through ways of norms that can be translatable, that could address some of these aspects. Now, I will say that when we talk about the Netzdurchführungsgesetz in Germany, that has, I think, received a lot of criticism. It's the issues that we are talking about, which is hate speech and defamation online, are generally very contextual and generally culturally very diverse. So you don't actually have to go to the global south to see the differences, but rather when you look within Europe, when you look at the national laws, and these are national laws on hate speech, they couldn't be more diverse. And that is just because of the history of each country and the sensitivities that result from the history of each country. You will have very diverse rules, and of course, it is very challenging then for companies that deliver their services on a global level to address this in a detail. And this is, I think, what we're currently working through also in the context of the Digital Services Act, which gives some frame of the responsibilities and diligence that online platforms or hosting service providers have to fulfill. And I believe that these due diligence obligations, they can actually be scaled and might in the context of national laws be quite adaptable. Yeah.
Do we actually have good examples of translatable standards, translatable norms? I'm just wondering, is it hard? So first, you have to understand other contexts while you're actually mostly working for your own. But also, is there enough incentive that this translation is even kept in mind, or does this need more advocacy in general, or more reminders for those who develop those norms?
Yeah, so I'm not a standards expert per se, but of course, in the context of how you certify against the to showcase that you're compliant with certain rules around data protection, be it GDPR or other existing legislation in other regions of the world, the certifications will rely on international standards, and through that you will achieve a certain translatability. And that is probably, and maybe to go a little bit into, we've just discussed a little bit, we've discussed quite a bit the issues, and the variety couldn't be broader. But maybe we can also move a little bit to the solutions. And in our very short pre-email exchange, we talked a little bit about, what that could be. We referenced the AI regulation. Mr. Benifei, who is now the rapporteur of the AI Act, has specifically also mentioned facial recognition technology. This has a really interesting, more detailed discussion. It's worth a more detailed discussion. Of course, it's certainly one of the high risk areas for democracy when governments start to use this type of technology for surveillance or to hinder freedom of expression in any way. But there is, I think, an opportunity for governments coming together with this multi-stakeholderism, this partnership, to start thinking about what are the norms they can commit to. And in the context of AI, the government's own best practice, I think, could lead the way when governments themselves commit, democratic governments themselves commit to use or deploy, well, should I say, deploy AI in a responsible, ethical way according to international human rights. And that type of commitment from democratic governments, I think, would be an addition, whether they are already there to legislate more specifically or not. I think that is something that could be a way forward to advance the more positive environment.
More.
I would say, Peter, you bring up one thing that I think is really important for us to note, which is that the concept of localization is not a new one to governments, to the private sector, or to civil society. It's been going on for hundreds of years, whether we look at shipping or extractives or, any other sort of standard setting area. So it's important that we look at it not as a limitation or a block, but as what it really is, which is difficult and challenging. And, we acknowledge that it's going to be, we can't snap our fingers, and it's a straw man to look for any sort of one standard or one way of doing things. And I think that's really valid, but it's not impossible, and it's also not new. But in all of those cases, one thing that we know, for it to work, any sort of standard setting or implementation or successful localization, is the normative framework around it, right? It's a necessary precondition to have systems in place. And that can be, parliaments that have jurisdiction over telcos, for instance, to keep the internet from being shut down. In many cases, that's never been the case. When you move into hate speech, you have a challenge over which environment is going to and which stakeholders are going to be involved in having those conversations. So I would urge us to look at that. And I think we can point to successes, maybe not so directly in a tech space, but we can point to, we can look at points of success in the tech space, but we can also rely on other models that are out there. So one good one that I think is really compelling is this idea of Gavi, which is the global effort on vaccinations. And, it's really a supply chain of beginning to end. And could there be lessons learned there in deployment of this, that we have, we can look to other sectors for models that we could potentially adopt here.
Fabro, any thoughts on this?
I have a thought on facial recognition, which is a good topic for us to discuss. Because get the two worlds when you compare global north, global south. There is no question that facial recognition can be used in a racist structure. If you look to Brazil, if you look to the countries, it impacts Black communities in a different way, it impacts white communities. But when I say that, I need to say that if you use facial recognition for mass surveillance with police forces, this is true. But if I say that you use facial recognition for bank inclusion, it is false. So the issue here is not about the technology. It's about one specific use of technology that is really urgent for us to pay attention and possibly regulate. At the same time, when you have the COVID crisis, in 2 weeks, Brazilian government had to pay 80 million people a welfare benefit. Out of those, 30% do not have access to the internet. 40% do not have a bank account. How do you do it? 2 weeks, or people starve. Face recognition. So there is a use here for technology that is inclusive for other communities. At the same time, there is a use for technology that might endanger those communities. So if you look at a moratorium, a ban on the technology, it's really key that to try to understand how developing technology for anti-identity fraud can be related to using that technology for agriculture or we use it for surveillance and a penal system. So I think face recognition is a good example of how important, key, strong debate might somehow endanger other debates because we just look for the technology, but not for the ecosystems of that technology being used. If you remove private sector from developing facial recognition or the public sector, how can we use facial recognition for inclusion in countries where we have low literacy, low digital literacy, and an extreme unequal digital ecosystem?
Cornelia called for solution orientation, made a few suggestions of solutions herself. Any other ideas of solutions around the table here? I guess a few we got already, including the ones from Fabro, look at the specific issues and start building things from there. Maybe I can also ask one question that I got here from the chat. There's quite a few that came in about artificial intelligence. So what is the thinking of the panelists about the Democracy Alliance for Artificial Intelligence specifically? Also a question about European Union attempts to regulate artificial intelligence. And this is a problem that a lot of AI is actually not coming from Europe or is coming from outside of Europe. Would that create hinders? So any specific thoughts that any of you would have on AI regulations in that direction?
And I can give a couple of words on how we think about the Commission's AI Act currently, which is sort of the one that is on the table, which is aimed at a horizontal legislation. First of all, we commend the Commission in taking this step. It shows again their leadership in and their focus on human rights, fundamental rights, and the human centricity. So at the same time, we have also supported the Commission's focus on high risk. That goes a little bit back to the discussion that we had earlier around processes and not having the right government structures to deal with some of these very complicated and always fast-moving developments in the technology space. And so in a way, what this does really is, well, we focus on what we know is potentially a risk for either safety or potential infringements of fundamental rights. And I think with the learnings that we will get from these applications, we will then also be able to advance a little bit more how we deal with these regulations. The specifics, and I'm not sure whether I'm going too much into detail then by talking about maybe the issues around it is the focus on a market surveillance system that might make sense for products, as this is one part of the regulation. So AI systems embedded in products. Here really the objective, the policy objective is the health and safety of people, right? But then there is this other area, and this is the area where we know all these anecdotal issues around discrimination or non-inclusion, which are services either provided by the government or services provided by private sector. And here, this market surveillance systems coming from products has some challenges, at least. One of which I'd say is there is no transparency embedded in the regulation vis-a-vis the impacted citizens, either by the deploying entity, and at the same time, and goes back to my suggestions with the norms, this commitment from how government will use AI. It is the accountability of how the AI is used that is extremely important, and the transparency by the deploying entity vis-a-vis its environments and the context in which it is deployed, that is so important for achieving this accountability and transparency, so that people can understand how they are potentially impacted. And that is, I think, something that needs a little bit course correction here, and will, in our belief, enhance this and strengthen the proposal, really.
So kind of from the producers also towards the users and the implementers of those technologies.
Well, it's a value. You have to put in, and this is maybe also more difficult in the AI context. There's, I think, two important points: is how is the AI created? How are AI systems created? There is a lot of general purpose AI that can be used by different entities in very different ways, some of which might be high risks and some users might not be. So the intention of the specific use by the specific deployer is, I think, very critical in whether we meet the human-centric objectives or whether we don't. And so the value chain is extremely important. Of course, how certain obligations need to be then divided, I think that is where there's current debate still going on. That's one area I think the act can be strengthened. The other is around the obligations per se, and that goes also back to how AI is created. If you try to adhere fairness in a system, you have to have a socio-technical approach to the problem. You will not be able to resolve it if you're just thinking about this as a technical issue. It is not. Fairness is an issue that has context, and so requires a much broader approach to solving it. And that is something, it's more difficult to solve because it's a really new challenge in regulating something. It's almost like you would regulate the person making decisions. It's more complicated. So a little bit more thinking through how this could be done, and thinking, formulating not the requirements, but the outcomes that we are trying to achieve. That is something that generally might help, by the way, what Fapo was saying, that, maybe that's the missing point in a government structure, that we need to really be more focused on what is the outcome, because then we can also think about the how to get there in a more holistic way.
Yeah, so I hear a lot context, and I guess this means in Fabro's sense also all context and not only selected ones, and for looking towards the outcomes, the goals, what we want to solve. Moira, Fabro, any more thoughts on this? Fabro?
Maybe on context, there is one topic we haven't addressed and is important, which is China. If you were having this conversation 10 years ago, maybe China would not be in the big picture. They are not an AI powered yet. This information was so separate from the other context that you could choose, we could discuss China and others. But more and more, China becomes a key player in this context. So we discussed, for example, private sector, and Chinese companies do have a different regulatory principle way of working than EU or US. And this is key. So in this information, for example, the apps stopped growing in the market in Brazil, iQueijo and TikTok. And probably they will become as stronger as WhatsApp and Telegram. Are we using the right tools to regulate it? Is the problem of this information configured in the right way? Look at what China is doing on AI regulation right now. They're breaking down user-centered platforms like banking systems, super apps, and so on, and they are investing in infrastructure platforms right now. So how we code, how we design, how we create interoperability. In a 5 years time, it might be a different scenario where we have to tackle the regulation we're doing today in a place where, in a context of China, that operates radically different. And it might be too efficient for us to just say that we want to have one globe, one rule, or one way of working. And it's so hard to understand Chinese context because it changes really fast. It's really dynamic. Language is a barrier. Academics are not really as integrated as other countries. So China, I think, is it's a really key topic for us to discuss it. What the regulator regulate right now will be sufficient to cope with China change in the ecosystem in 5 years' time? This might be a key question for us to understand where we're going and understand the context.
Just to follow up on that, as the American in the room, I think it's also really important that we not make this a US versus China conversation, right? Because what we have discovered from our conversations around the globe is that that's an unproductive conversation when you are looking at the choices faced by a government. What I think we do need to emphasize, however, and what we try to talk about are a couple of things. One is the values-based system that comes with the technologies that asking governments and asking civil society to sort of look at the models that they can approach when looking at infrastructure and make it a question of values and a question of localization. Right. So one of the dynamics we see when we talk about the global deployment of 5G is that it is the equivalent of turning your superhighways over to another country. And, as long as the CCP and as long as the regulations exist that do within China, that's not a choice for a lot of the companies that are operating in this space. And so it becomes a matter of transparency and understanding the trade-offs and the choices. But and I very much think, from our perspective, that when presented in a clear perspective with those choices of ownership over your own data, ownership and control being placed in the hands of the user, and in a transparent, rights-based way and in a values-based way, that's going to be the winning argument versus a US China, which is, no one wants to be in anyone's great power competition, and that is completely understandable. But I think the West needs to do a better job, or Western companies, values-based companies need to do a better job of owning that conversation, and all of us coming to the table to make that case, because it's not being done effectively at this point.
Fabro?
Just to chip in more, I think she has the key wording for that. It's not about polarization, it's about dialogue. I think when we put China in the table, it becomes so clear that we need more dialogue and not polarization, because it's about ecosystems, it's about the elephant in the room, how we describe it, how we design a good solution. Thank you very much for the highlight.
Thanks so much, Fabio. So actually, we are only like a few minutes before the end of the session. So I don't think there is any questions from the audience I'm seeing here. So just any last statements, any last remarks any of you wanted to make? Closing round?
Well, I can just say that, I mean, the discussion has been on a variety of issues, but solving all of those will support, I think, what this week is about is the democratic structures in which we want to continue to live. And I think for democratic nations, both on the US side and in Europe and elsewhere around the globe, it is really important to come together and find at least the common values in which we can advance these progress, even if some approaches might be distinct, if the principles and the values are agreed upon, I think then we can also, and I think that is sort of coming out of this China discussion at the beginning. I think what we have seen over the last couple of years is unfortunately decline in democracies. So democracies and this brings in again the partnership with civil society and industry. We have all a common interest in securing and eventually advancing and fighting back for democracy around the world. And so I will just say thank you for having these discussions for this whole week, because it's so important.
Thank you. Moira, any last remarks?
I would just say, to kind of harken back to some things to ground us, which is that one, this week we've seen new data come out that more people in the world want democracy and want these systems to work for them, want technology to work on behalf of democracy, than want to use it to control others. And I think we need to first acknowledge that we're on the right side of this conversation and that we do have the opportunity. And then just to remind us all that when we look at our own history in global affairs, we have done big things and we can do big things when it comes to controlling technologies. And I always harken back to the Cold War and looking that, what saved the world from destruction was a series of meetings that continue to move forward and evolve. And, it was a lot of meetings and a lot of conversation and a lot of dialogue, public pressure, involvement of civil society, values-based approaches from governments, dialogue, and it's not a direct analogy certainly, but we can draw lessons in terms of what worked and acknowledge that we can and have done big things. And I would just urge us all to move in that general direction, but also move a lot faster.
Fabio?
I just want to say that doors are open here in Brazil for dialogues and conversation. We worked in the past with the Berkman Klein Center and Harvard University for mapping the principles of AI. We're now working with Australian partners to present the G7 Charter of Principles to help to understand. We collaborate with you, and I think I was the rapporteur for open government in Brazil for 6 years for the Open Government Partnership. And creating these institutions that create dialogue with governments is uncharted territory. We are 8 billion people. We do not have the knowledge on how to govern us some way. So I love the experiences of designing these systems. And the frustrations comes from it's a too complex society. But I think we do have very good topics here on the table that we can look at things. And in the positive, negative, how full, how empty cup of water, I would just say we'll get worse. It will become more complex, not less complex. So that's why dialogue is so important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So certainly, I think we all then agree dialogue, conversations, meetings are an important part of the way forward. I hope we made a tiny contribution with our event today as well. So thank you so much for all the panelists participating here for this great discussion. just to say that this is the last session of Democracy Week for today, but there will be more events coming up, including about the Eastern neighborhood, I think tomorrow morning. So thanks a lot, everybody, and yeah, have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.